It began the way small, harmless things often do, quietly, almost like laughter slipping under a door. The kind of laughter that doesn't yet know what it's about to cost you. I remember that night with the clarity of a bruise, the scent of rain-soaked soil rising from the cracked sidewalk, the flicker of the streetlight stuttering like a heartbeat that didn't know whether to stop or keep going. I was younger then, or at least I told myself I was. Even though youth had already begun to peel away from me like old wallpaper. He was just a neighbor, an old man with eyes that seemed to hold too many midnights. But something in the way he looked at me made the air heavy, the way heat clings before a storm. I didn't mean to let it go that far. It was supposed to be a joke, a harmless tease between boredom and curiosity, a way to prove that nothing still mattered, that I could play with the edges of fire without getting burned. But people are not edges, and desire is never just a spark. What started as a moment I could laugh off became a confession I couldn't speak without shaking. There are nights now when I still hear the echo of that laughter, like a ghost remembering its body. And I wonder if he hears it too, wherever he is, still smiling at the ruin we made together. Before we go deeper into this story, I need to be honest. My heart sank when I saw that nearly 90% of you who watch these stories never subscribe. If you feel something when you listen, even the smallest ache, please like and subscribe. That one small click keeps these stories breathing, and it means more than you know. If you've ever found yourself staring too long at the line between what's right and what's forbidden, stay with me. Share this if you've ever carried a secret that changed your skin, and subscribe if you believe that sometimes the most dangerous stories are the ones that sound like love. The first time I noticed him, the world was quiet in that heavy way it gets just before dusk settles in. The sun had melted into the horizon, spilling its last amber light across the street like a secret it couldn't keep any longer. I remember the hum of cicadas vibrating through the air, the faint smell of cut grass mixing with rain that hadn't yet fallen. I was standing by my window, pretending to care about the view, pretending that I wasn't looking for something, anything, to interrupt the monotony that had taken root in me. Then I saw him, the old man from next door. He was sweeping his porch with slow, deliberate strokes, his shoulders curved inward like someone carrying the weight of too many yesterdays. There was nothing remarkable about him, not at first glance. His shirt was always half-buttoned, his skin the color of dark oak, his eyes hidden behind thin-rimmed glasses that caught the evening light. Yet there was something in the way he moved, steady, unbothered, like he had already made peace with the things that haunted other people. I think that's what drew me to him, that quiet self-assurance, the way he seemed untouched by the noise of the world. In a neighborhood where people rarely looked up from their phones or spoke beyond a polite nod, he seemed like a relic of something slower, something more human. It started with small things. A nod when I passed by. A comment about the weather. One afternoon he joked that I always looked like I was running from something. I laughed, though it wasn't funny, and I told him maybe I was. He smiled in that way old people sometimes do, half amusement, half understanding, and said that if I kept running long enough, I'd eventually end up back where I started. It was a strange thing to say to a near stranger, but it lingered with me long after I'd gone back inside. That night, I replayed the exchange in my head, the tone of his voice, the way his eyes didn't quite match his smile. It wasn't flirtation, not yet. It was more like curiosity meeting loneliness in a quiet room. I found myself wondering what his house looked like inside, what kind of music he listened to, whether he lived alone. The next morning, I caught myself dressing slower than usual, brushing my hair twice, checking the mirror as though I had somewhere important to be. I told myself it was nothing, just a neighborly habit, an idle interest. But even as I thought it, I felt the lie catch in my throat. Days slipped into weeks, and the small talk grew easier, the pauses between words more deliberate. He had this way of speaking that made silence feel intentional, as if every unspoken thing still had meaning. Once, when a sudden gust of wind scattered the mail I'd been holding, he bent to help me pick it up. Our hands brushed, barely accidentally, but the touch lingered longer than it should have. My pulse stuttered, betraying me. I laughed to cover it, said something stupid about gravity being against me. He looked up, smiling, and said softly, "Gravity's got nothing to do with it." I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, my own heartbeat echoing louder than it should. I told myself I was imagining it, that he hadn't meant anything by it. But the mind is a cruel translator. It hears what it wants to hear, sees what it wishes were true. I began to notice more about him. The faint scar along his left hand. The way he paused before answering questions, like he was measuring how much truth a person could handle. I wondered what had carved those silences into him. There was one evening, late in the summer, when the air was heavy and restless, and the power went out across the neighborhood. I stepped outside and he was there, sitting on his porch, a candle flickering beside him. He called out, asked if I was afraid of the dark. I said no, though the truth was more complicated. He told me to come sit for a while, said it was better to wait out the blackout with company. I hesitated, then crossed the small patch of grass between our houses, each step feeling like a trespass. We sat together in the glow of that single candle. The world felt smaller, quieter, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away. He told me stories about the neighborhood, about the people who used to live there, about how time changes faces but never the soil beneath them. His voice was low, roughened by age, but there was warmth in it, a steady rhythm that made me forget the space between us. At one point, I asked him if he ever got lonely. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Everyone does," he said finally. "Some just get better at pretending they don't." Something in the way he said it made my chest tighten. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. I realized then how much of my own life had been built on pretending to be fine, pretending not to care, pretending I didn't crave connection in ways that scared me. He didn't ask what I was running from again, but I think he already knew. When the power finally came back, we didn't move right away. The sudden brightness felt intrusive, almost vulgar, as if it had interrupted something sacred. I thanked him for the company, and he just nodded, eyes lingering on me a moment too long. After that night, something shifted. The air between us changed, charged with an unspoken tension neither of us wanted to name. Our conversations became shorter, more loaded. A glance held too long, a laugh that meant more than it should. And yet, every time I told myself to step back, to stop feeding whatever this was, I found myself drawn to it again, like a moth circling the same flame it knows will destroy it. I told myself it was harmless, that he was just a kind old man and I was just bored, searching for something to make me feel alive again. But deep down, I already knew better. Because when I caught him watching me from his porch the next morning, the look in his eyes wasn't neighborly. It was knowing. And for the first time, I didn't look away. The door between us had opened quietly, almost politely. Neither of us had meant to walk through it. But once you cross a threshold like that, there's no going back. It was a look, just a look, but it changed everything. I had grown used to his gaze by then, the steady, measured way he saw me, not as someone young or restless, but as if I were a puzzle he already knew the shape of. That morning, I waved to him across the yard, my hand raised in a gesture that was supposed to be friendly, casual. But when he smiled back, I said something I shouldn't have. Something small, teasing, harmless. Or that's what I told myself. "Careful," I'd said. "You keep looking at me like that and people will start talking." He laughed, a deep, quiet sound that rolled from his chest like the first note of a storm. "Let them talk," he said. His voice was light, but there was a gravity beneath it, something that pulled me in even as I tried to step away. I remember the way his eyes caught the morning light, soft but steady, and for a heartbeat I couldn't find my voice. I told myself it was just a joke. I was only teasing. But when I went back inside, the air felt different, warmer, charged, almost alive. After that, everything became an unspoken game. A shared language made of glances and half-smiles, of things we both pretended not to mean. I'd catch him watching me from his porch as I watered the plants or carried groceries in from the car. Sometimes he'd lift his hand, a lazy wave that lingered in the air just long enough to feel deliberate. And sometimes, when the day was quiet enough, I'd wave back. It was nothing, I told myself. Just two neighbors passing time. Just a little joke to make the days less heavy. But jokes have a way of turning into truths when you repeat them long enough. One evening, I found myself sitting outside again, the same spot where I had first seen him in the fading light. He was there too, as if the universe had arranged the scene to test my will. He asked if I wanted a drink. I hesitated only a moment before crossing the yard. His porch smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar, the kind of scent that made you think of old stories and broken promises. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed me one, his hand brushing mine. "To curiosity," he said, raising his glass. I smiled, but the word hung heavy between us, too honest, too close to what I was afraid of. We talked for hours, about nothing and everything. The way time bends, how people forget themselves in small towns, how laughter can sometimes sound like forgiveness. He told me about his late wife, how she used to hum while folding laundry, how silence after her death became a language of its own. There was no pity in his voice, just memory softened by time. I listened, drawn to the way he spoke, slow, deliberate, as if every word had been chosen with care. I wanted to ask him things I shouldn't, wanted to know if he saw the same loneliness in me that I saw in him. But I didn't. I just let the silence fill the space between us. At some point, I said something I thought was funny. I don't even remember the words, only that I meant it as a joke, something light to break the heaviness. But he didn't laugh right away. He looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable, and then said quietly, "You shouldn't play like that." The words were soft, but they cut through the night like glass. My face grew warm, my chest tight. "It was just a joke," I said. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he knew I didn't mean it that way anymore. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way his voice had changed when he said it. The way my own laughter had turned brittle, unsure of itself. Every time I saw him, I felt caught between apology and anticipation. We still spoke, still joked, but there was an edge now, a tension beneath every word. It was like walking through fog, unable to see the drop ahead but feeling it all the same. Then came the evening that changed everything. I'd had a bad day, one of those endless, colorless days where nothing feels right. I stepped outside for air, only to find him standing at the fence, waiting. He said he'd heard me arguing on the phone earlier, asked if I was all right. I told him it was nothing. He didn't believe me. "You don't have to keep pretending," he said. The way he said it made me ache. Maybe it was the whiskey still burning in my chest from earlier. Maybe it was the way his voice softened at the edges. But I laughed, tired and reckless. "You really think you know me that well?" I asked. He smiled. "Well enough." The silence that followed was unbearable. I said something impulsive then. Something like, "Careful, old man? I might start thinking you actually care." I expected him to laugh, to brush it off like we always did. But he didn't. He just looked at me, long and steady, his eyes catching the faint light from the street. "Maybe I do," he said. I felt my breath catch. The world around us seemed to shrink until there was nothing left but that moment. It should have ended there. I should have laughed it off, made another joke, stepped back across the line we'd drawn between us. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed, rooted to the ground, unable to move as something unspoken passed between us, something neither of us could name without shattering it. The days that followed were heavier. Our conversations grew sparse, but the air between us hummed with the memory of that night. Every glance was a confession, every silence an invitation. I'd catch myself standing by the window again, waiting for him to appear, pretending I wasn't. When he finally did, our eyes would meet for a second too long, and I'd feel that same pull, that same dangerous warmth creeping up my spine. It was still just a joke, I told myself. Still harmless. But even I didn't believe it anymore. Because deep down, I knew we had already crossed something invisible. What had started as laughter had turned into longing. And the worst part was how natural it felt. He began to find excuses to see me, returning borrowed things I didn't remember lending, asking for help with his phone, stopping by with leftovers from a dinner I hadn't attended. Each visit shorter than the last, but heavier. One evening, as I opened my door to let him in, our hands brushed again, just like before. Only this time, neither of us moved away. The air grew still, the space between us trembling like a held breath. And then, without meaning to, I laughed. A quiet, nervous laugh, the kind that hides more than it reveals. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You really should stop laughing like that," he said softly. "One day you won't be able to." I didn't understand what he meant then. Not fully, but I felt it. That we were no longer pretending. That the joke was over, even if neither of us had the courage to admit it. And so we stayed there, two people on either side of a line we'd already erased, listening to the sound of our own silence, waiting for something to break. It happened the way most irreversible things do, not with a crash, not with a shout, but with a quiet so thick it pressed against the skin. I remember the sky that night, pale, the color of smoke, the moon tucked behind a veil of thin clouds. The world felt suspended, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had told myself I wouldn't see him again, that I needed distance, clarity, whatever word would make the ache sound less like longing. But loneliness has its own logic, its own gravity, and that night, it pulled me back toward him. His porch light was on when I stepped outside. A single yellow glow, soft against the dark. I told myself I was just going to say hello, just to prove to myself that I could. But when he opened the door, the smell of warmth and memory flooded out. A mix of old wood, whiskey, and the faint spice of something cooking. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low as though he'd been expecting me. I should have said goodnight. I should have walked away. Instead, I nodded. Inside, the house felt timeless. There were photographs on the walls, faces half faded by sun and years. A record player hummed softly in the corner, the needle dragging across an old blues track. The music filled the silence between us, slow and heavy, the kind of song that doesn't just play, it lingers, like smoke curling around your thoughts. He poured a drink without asking, set it in front of me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "I shouldn't be here," I said finally. He looked at me over the rim of his glass. "You've been saying that for weeks," he replied. I wanted to argue, but he was right. I had been saying it, and yet here I was again. There was something in his calm that both disarmed and infuriated me. He didn't reach for me, didn't move closer, just sat there waiting. That stillness drew me in, like a dare. We talked at first about nothing. The way the weather had turned colder, how quiet the neighborhood had become, how time felt slower at night. But the words felt empty, placeholders for what neither of us wanted to admit. His eyes kept finding mine, steady, patient. There was no pretense anymore. No jokes, no laughter. Just the unbearable weight of knowing. I remember setting my glass down, the faint clink of it on the table, the tremor in my hand betraying what I was trying to hide. He asked me what I was afraid of. I wanted to tell him everything, the gossip, the judgment, the shame. But none of those were the truth. What scared me most was how natural it felt to be there, how right. So instead I said, "You." He smiled then, but it wasn't mockery. It was quiet understanding. "You should be," he said softly. And then he stood, slow and deliberate, and the air changed. I could feel the pulse in my neck, the way the room seemed to tilt just slightly. When he stepped closer, I didn't move back. When his hand brushed mine, I didn't flinch. The moment stretched, fragile, inevitable. When it finally happened, it wasn't passion that defined it. It was surrender. A kind of tired, desperate surrender that comes when two people run out of reasons to pretend. His touch was gentle, hesitant at first, like he was afraid I might disappear. My breath caught somewhere between fear and relief. It wasn't what I'd imagined. It was quieter, sadder, more human. And yet, in that moment, everything I had tried to hold together came undone. After, we sat in silence, the record still spinning, the needle long past the end of the song. I remember tracing the edge of my glass, the sound of the wind outside. He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes I couldn't read. Guilt, maybe, or just the knowledge that something sacred had been broken. "You don't have to stay," he said. His voice was calm, but his hands trembled slightly. I wanted to speak, to say something that would make it make sense. But the words wouldn't come. I stood, dressed slowly, my fingers fumbling with the buttons as if they'd forgotten how to move. When I stepped out into the night, the air was cold, sharp. The sky had cleared, and the moon was out now, bright and indifferent. I walked home barefoot, my shoes dangling from my hand, the grass cool beneath my feet. Every step felt like a confession. I thought of the way his voice had cracked on my name, the way my own laughter had died on my lips. It should have felt wrong. Maybe it did. But beneath the guilt, there was something else, a strange calm, like the eye of a storm. The days that followed were a blur. I avoided him, avoided the mirror, avoided the questions I knew I couldn't answer. But avoidance doesn't erase what's already been written. The memory lingered like a scent that refused to fade. I caught glimpses of him sometimes. Through the window across the street, his expression unreadable. Neither of us spoke. The silence became its own kind of punishment, and then came the first crack in the wall I'd built. A message, simple, almost mundane. "You left your scarf." I could have ignored it. I almost did. But that single sentence carried everything we hadn't said. I replied before I could stop myself. "Keep it." He didn't respond. But that night, I found the scarf folded neatly on my doorstep. No note, no explanation. Just the quiet reminder that the world was smaller than I wanted it to be. Betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quietest sound in the room, the closing of a door, the click of a lighter, the way a name feels when spoken by someone who shouldn't say it. I told myself that it had been a mistake, that I could pretend it hadn't happened, but pretending requires distance, and distance was the one thing I'd already lost. It wasn't love. It wasn't even lust. It was need, raw, human, unfiltered. The need to be seen, to be known, even if it was by the wrong person. But what began as solace soon turned to silence, and in that silence, something dark began to take root. Because once you cross that line, you start to see the world differently. Every glance becomes a question. Every word carries a weight. I could feel it in the way people looked at me, the way they asked harmless questions that didn't sound harmless anymore. The betrayal wasn't just against someone else, it was against myself. And yet, I couldn't undo it. I didn't want to. Because for one night, I had felt something real. Something dangerous but real. And that, I think, is the cruelest kind of betrayal. The one that feels like truth. The first sign that the world had shifted came not from him, but from them, from the eyes that lingered too long, the whispers that stopped when I entered a room, the way silence began to follow me like a shadow that knew my name. It was subtle at first, almost easy to ignore. A neighbor who suddenly had too much to say about how friendly I'd become, a friend who asked one too many careful questions, a silence on the phone from someone who used to fill every pause with laughter. The air around me felt heavier now, not from guilt alone, but from the weight of being seen. He, meanwhile, seemed untouched by it all. I'd see him from across the street, sweeping his porch or tending to the wilted flowers by the fence, his movements as measured as ever. There was no sign in him of the storm I felt inside. That calmness both steadied and enraged me. I wanted him to flinch, to show some sign of the same trembling that had rooted itself in my bones. But when our eyes met, all I saw was quiet certainty, and that frightened me more than any rumor could. I began to avoid him, not out of resolve, but out of necessity. Every encounter risked exposure, every shared glance a possibility of discovery. The smallest things felt loaded now. The distance between our mailboxes, the timing of the garbage pickup, the way our shadows sometimes met on the pavement before we did. Each day was a negotiation between guilt and desire, between wanting to undo what I had done and wanting to live inside it, even if it destroyed me. The whispers grew louder. A woman at the grocery store smiled too knowingly. A friend's husband mentioned he'd seen me chatting late with the old man next door, his tone too casual to be innocent. I laughed it off, but inside I could feel something cracking, a hairline fracture in the illusion I'd built. Shame is a strange kind of fire. It burns without light, without heat, consuming you quietly from within. I told myself that if I just stayed silent, if I kept moving through the motions of normal life, it would fade. But the thing about secrets is that they don't stay buried. They grow roots, wrapping themselves around everything that once felt safe. He didn't make it easier. He'd still wave sometimes, as though daring the world to look closer. Once I found a note slipped under my door, just a few words written in his uneven handwriting. "You're not alone." I read it over and over, not sure whether to be comforted or terrified. I wanted to tear it up, but I couldn't. Instead, I folded it neatly and hid it in the drawer beside my bed, as if keeping it close might keep the rest of the world at bay. It was around that time that I started to see myself differently. Every reflection felt like a stranger's face staring back. My laugh sounded too loud, my voice too careful. The mirror became an enemy, showing not who I was but who I had become. I wondered if he felt it too, that creeping distance between who we pretended to be and who we really were. I never asked. We stopped talking, not because we wanted to, but because we didn't know how to anymore. The space between us filled with everything unsaid, and yet, late at night, I'd still see the light from his window flicker through my curtains. It wasn't comfort anymore. It was reminder. A pulse in the dark saying, "You did this. You let it happen." I tried to hate him for it. Sometimes I even succeeded for a while. But hate, like love, requires proximity, and distance only sharpened the ache. The turning point came one gray afternoon when I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, he was standing there, hat in hand, eyes calm but tired. He said he was leaving for a while, visiting family out of town. His voice was steady, almost detached, as if he were speaking to a neighbor again and not to the person who had crossed that unspoken line with him. I wanted to say something, to ask him to stay or to go forever, to give me something definitive. But the words tangled in my throat. All I could manage was a nod. He smiled then, faintly. "Take care of yourself," he said. When the door closed, I felt something inside me break in a way that didn't make a sound. The house was suddenly too big, too quiet. His absence filled every room, every corner. It wasn't longing anymore, it was grief. Not for him exactly, but for the version of myself that had existed before that first night, before that first choice. Days turned to weeks. The gossip eventually thinned, as it always does when people find new stories to feed on. But even as the noise faded, the silence didn't bring peace. It brought reflection. I saw how easily connection can become captivity, how quickly affection curdles when exposed to the light. I learned that betrayal doesn't end when the act does. It echoes, reshaping the way you see everything after. Once, I walked past his house and saw someone else on the porch, a relative perhaps, or a friend. The flowers were gone, the broom leaning unused against the railing. For the first time, I realized how old he truly was, how fragile. He had seemed so steady, so untouchable, but time catches everyone eventually. I wondered if he thought of me, if my name still lingered somewhere in his mind like a mistake that tasted too sweet to forget. That night, I opened my drawer and found the note again. The paper had begun to yellow at the edges, the ink smudged where my thumb had pressed too hard. "You're not alone." I held it under the light, read it again, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of what those words meant. I wasn't alone, but not in the way he'd meant. I was haunted by him, by us, by the choices that had marked me quietly but permanently. The world had gone back to normal, but I hadn't. I walked through my days as if through fog. Each familiar face a reminder of how easy it is to hide behind laughter, how fragile the distance is between virtue and desire. And when I passed the fence that once divided us, I realized it was never the wood that separated our lives. It was the line we had drawn and then ignored, the one that no amount of silence could ever rebuild. When people speak of fallout, they imagine destruction, something loud, final, catastrophic. But this wasn't that. This was slower, quieter, a decay that began from the inside out. It didn't end with him leaving. It began there. Because once you've tasted something forbidden, you spend the rest of your life trying to forget the flavor. And forgetting, I was learning, is a kind of punishment all its own. The house across the street is empty now. The curtains are gone, the porch stripped bare. Sometimes when I pass by, I still half expect to see him there. The slow, deliberate rhythm of his broom, the faint nod of acknowledgement, that quiet calm that once felt like a refuge. But there is only wind now, only the faint creak of the porch steps when no one is standing on them. Time has a way of erasing people gently, the way the tide takes back footprints. It never feels like loss at first. Just absence. Just space. But space, when filled with memory, becomes a kind of ghost. They say healing is a matter of distance, that once you are far enough away from the fire, the burn will fade. But distance doesn't heal, it distorts. The farther I move from those nights, the less I recognize myself in them. And yet, every so often something small, a scent of tobacco on a stranger's jacket, a certain turn of voice pulls me back to that porch, to that dim light, to that moment when laughter tipped into silence. I tell myself I've forgiven myself for it, but forgiveness is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive as a moment of clarity. It comes in pieces, some days softer than others, and even when it comes, it never stays long. I think now of what drove me there in the first place. The hunger, not for him, but for acknowledgement. To be seen, not as someone's daughter or friend or shadow, but as something whole and undeniable. He saw me that way, or maybe I only thought he did. Maybe I mistook attention for affection, and affection for love. It's easy to confuse the two when you've been unseen for too long. He filled a silence I hadn't realized was killing me. And in return, I became the echo that filled his. We didn't love each other. We recognized each other's loneliness, and mistook it for something bigger. I heard he moved away quietly, the way he lived. Some say to stay with his son in another state, others that he fell ill. No one knows for sure, but I sometimes dream of him standing on that porch again, not old, not young, just still. In the dream, I walk toward him, but the closer I get, the more his face fades, until all that's left is the light behind him. I wake up with the sound of his voice still lingering in my mind, that deep calm that once felt like truth. Everyone gets lonely. Some just get better at pretending they don't. There are days when I think of writing about it, about him, about me, about the slow way lives entangle and break. Not to confess, but to understand. Stories have a way of softening what reality makes sharp. They turn mistakes into metaphors, choices into inevitabilities. But the truth is, some things don't fit neatly into storylines. Some things just happen, and the meaning follows you afterward, shapeless and stubborn. What we did wasn't right, but it was real. And reality, however flawed, has its own kind of permanence. Sometimes when it rains, I stand by my window and watch the drops slide down the glass, tracing the same paths they always have. The street outside glows with the reflection of streetlights, and for a moment, everything looks the same as it did that first night. The air heavy, the sky bruised, the faint hum of the city half asleep. I imagine him out there, sweeping the porch, looking up just long enough to catch my eye. It's strange how memory works. You forget faces, but not feelings. You forget the words, but not the silence between them. People think betrayal is an act, a single moment of crossing a line. But it isn't. It's a series of small surrenders, each one quieter than the last, until you wake one morning and realize you've built a life out of apologies you'll never say aloud. I used to think what happened was his fault, or mine, or maybe both. But blame doesn't hold shape anymore. What remains isn't anger, it's understanding. That sometimes two people meet at the wrong time, in the wrong way, and the world bends under the weight of it. There's a kind of peace in the aftermath, though. Not the bright, redemptive kind that stories promise, but a slower, humbler peace. The kind that comes when the fire has burned everything it can, and all that's left is ash. And from the ash, the faint scent of what once was. I've learned to live with that scent. It follows me, yes, but not to haunt. Just to remind. Of who I was, of what I wanted, of the cost of wanting. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself smiling at the thought of him. Not because of what we were, but because of what we revealed in each other. The fragility, the desire, the quiet desperation to matter. In the end, we were both just trying to fill a void, and for a moment we succeeded. It wasn't love, not really. But it was something that felt alive. And for a time, that was enough. Now, when the laughter of strangers drifts through my window, when a neighbor waves from across the street, I find myself nodding back without hesitation. I've learned that distance doesn't have to mean exile, that silence doesn't have to mean absence. The past doesn't vanish. It settles. It becomes part of the air you breathe, part of the person you carry forward. He is gone. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still hear the echo of his voice in my mind. Soft, steady, unhurried. And I think maybe that's what remains after everything else has burned away. Not the pain, not the guilt, but the echo. The reminder that I was here, that I lived, that for better or worse I felt something real. The fire ended a long time ago, but the light it cast still flickers, faint and steady, somewhere inside me.